There are some things a husband should not be able to drain from his wife's bank account. $800,000 is one of them. This is the story of Mira Voss, a 41-year-old art curator with quiet eyes and a soft voice, who spent 12 years married to a man who had been planning, for the last 18 months, to take every single thing she owned and walk away. His name was Ansel Voss, an investment broker from Westchester County, New York. 44 years old. Confident in the easy, casual way that wealthy men are confident. The kind of man who orders the most expensive wine on the menu without looking at the price. The kind of man who tells women he loves them while watching the door. The kind of man who underestimates everyone in the room except himself. What Ansel Voss had decided 18 months earlier was that he was finished being married to Mira. He had not, however, decided to leave her. That would have been honest. That would have cost him too much. What he had decided, instead, was something far more elegant. He was going to quietly drain the $4 million inheritance Mira had received when her grandfather died. He was going to move the money in small, careful increments through a series of offshore accounts. He was going to buy his mistress a $1.4 million beach house in the Hamptons. And then, when Mira finally noticed her own money was gone, which he believed would happen in approximately 3 to 4 years, given how little she paid attention to finances, he was going to apologize, file for divorce, and start his new life with a woman who actually understood, in his opinion, what a man like him deserved. Ansel Voss thought of everything, except one thing. In 12 years of marriage, he had never once bothered to ask what his wife's father did for a living. He knew vaguely that the man worked in banking. He had assumed, the way men like Ansel always assume, that this meant Theodore Galloway was some kind of small-town teller. Some quiet, retiring sort of fellow who balanced ledgers and handled mortgage applications and went home to his slippers at 5 o'clock. What he had never bothered to learn, what he had been too proud, in 12 years of family dinners and Christmas mornings and quiet Sunday brunches, to ever quite ask, was that Theodore Galloway was the regional president of First Continental Bank. The same First Continental Bank that managed Mira's $4 million inheritance. The same First Continental Bank that flagged every single transaction over $10,000 on her account. The same First Continental Bank where Theodore Galloway, every Monday morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., sat down at his desk on the 14th floor and personally reviewed every flagged transaction involving his daughter's name. For 14 months, Theodore Galloway had been reading the flagged reports. For 14 months, he had said nothing. He had been waiting. This is the story of what he was waiting for. And the 88th birthday speech he gave at his country club, in front of 230 guests, that ended his son-in-law's life as he knew it in exactly 7 minutes. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Mira Voss had not always been a wealthy woman. She had grown up in a quiet New England town as the only child of Theodore and Cordelia Galloway, comfortable certainly, but not rich. Her father had been a young assistant manager at a small regional bank then. Her mother had taught piano lessons to the neighborhood children. Mira had ridden her bicycle to school. She had worked summer jobs at the local library. She had attended a small liberal arts college on a partial scholarship, and she had graduated with a degree in art history and a head full of paintings she wanted to spend her life understanding. She had met Ansel Voss in her last semester at Boston University. He had been 3 years older, already in his first year at a Manhattan investment firm. He was charming. He had been ambitious. He had been, in those early days, almost embarrassingly attentive to her in a way no man had ever been before. He had told her, sitting on the Boston Common on a cold November afternoon, holding her gloved hand in both of his, that he had never met a woman who saw the world the way she did. She had believed him. She was 23 years old. They had married 18 months later in a small ceremony at her parents' home. Her father had walked her down the aisle. Her mother had cried quietly. Ansel's family had flown in from Connecticut, polite and reserved and slightly too aware of where everyone in the room had gone to college. Mira had been happy. She had been happy for a long time. Her grandfather, her father's father, a quiet retired investment banker named Augustus Galloway, had died 7 years into the marriage. He had died gently in his sleep at the age of 91. He had left, to his only granddaughter, a trust fund containing $4,200,000, along with a single oil painting of a quiet European harbor that he had told Mira, when she was 9 years old, was the most beautiful painting in the world. The painting now hung in the entryway of Mira's home. The $4 million sat in a private wealth management account at First Continental Bank. The account was managed, quietly, personally, with the kind of detailed attention only a grandfather and father can give, by Mira's own father, Theodore Galloway. Theodore had not, at the time, been the regional president of First Continental. He had been the senior vice president of private wealth management, the man personally responsible in 2018 for managing the bank's most significant individual accounts. It had been Theodore who had set up the trust. Theodore who had structured the disbursements. Theodore who had quietly ensured that every single penny of his daughter's inheritance was protected by every conceivable legal mechanism the law would allow. Ansel had been aware of the inheritance, of course. He had attended the funeral. He had stood beside his wife as the will was read. He had even briefly met with the lawyers, playing the role of the supportive young husband, asking polite questions about tax implications, offering to help Mira manage the funds going forward. Theodore had thanked him politely. He had said that he was happy to manage the account himself for the time being. He had said that Mira had grown up with a complicated relationship to money, and that he believed it would be best for her financial stability if the funds remained, for now, under his direct oversight. Ansel had agreed. He was 33 years old then. He had been freshly promoted to senior broker. He had not, at that exact moment, decided to take any of his wife's inheritance. That decision came 5 years later. It had come in the early hours of a cold November morning, when Ansel Voss had stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 4:30 in the morning, unable to sleep, and had looked at himself with a kind of slow, expanding clarity that he had not, in his entire adult life, allowed himself to feel before. He had thought, I am 43 years old. I have spent 20 years working in finance. I have made every right decision. I have done every correct thing. And I am, in the end, married to a woman whose father controls a fortune I will never personally see. He had thought, I deserve more than this. He had thought, and I am going to take it. By sunrise, he had a plan. By the end of the month, he had begun executing it. What Ansel did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that on the morning he had stood in front of his bathroom mirror making that decision, his father-in-law Theodore Galloway, 67 years old, had been recently promoted to regional president of First Continental Bank, with personal oversight authority over every single private wealth management account at every branch in the Northeast region of the United States, including the account containing his daughter's $4 million inheritance. The job came with one detail Theodore had not initially anticipated. He now received, every Monday morning at 7:15 a.m., a complete report of every flagged transaction over $10,000 on every private account under his region's management. He had not, in the first 6 months of his promotion, ever expected to see his daughter's name on one of those reports. When he saw it for the first time, on the morning of February 14th, exactly 12 days after Ansel had made his decision in front of the bathroom mirror, Theodore Galloway sat very still in his 14th floor office for a very long time. He read the report 3 times. Then he picked up his phone, called his old friend Marcus Brennan at the FBI's white-collar division, and arranged to meet him for lunch. And then he closed the report. He put it in his locked drawer. He said nothing to his daughter. He waited. For 14 months, Theodore Galloway watched his son-in-law steal from his daughter. He watched it slowly. He watched it carefully. He watched it with the calm, methodical patience of a man who had spent 43 years in banking and who understood, in a way Ansel Voss never would, that there is no theft so clever that the right bank cannot trace it. The first transaction had been small. $12,000, transferred from Mira's private wealth account into a joint household account that Ansel and Mira shared. The transfer had been technically legal. Mira had signed paperwork 7 years earlier giving Ansel limited authority over joint funds. But the timing had been suspicious. The withdrawal had been made on a Tuesday afternoon, while Mira was at a museum opening in Boston. Ansel had used his own login credentials. The money had then moved, within 48 hours, into a brokerage account in Ansel's name only. From there, it had moved into a series of small investments, none of them particularly profitable, none of them particularly traceable to any specific outcome. The investments had been, Theodore understood almost immediately, a laundering pattern. Ansel was moving the money through a series of legitimate-looking financial instruments to obscure its origin before depositing it into something far less legitimate. By the end of the third month, Theodore had identified the actual destination. A real estate holding company in Delaware called Sycamore Crest LLC. Sycamore Crest LLC had been incorporated 9 months earlier. Its sole owner of record was a 32-year-old woman named Sydney Carrington, a real estate agent based in Westchester County. The company's sole asset, by the time Theodore traced it in May, was a $1.4 million beach house in East Hampton, New York. The beach house had been purchased in cash. The cash had come, through 6 layers of laundering, from Mira's inheritance. Theodore Galloway sat at his desk on the morning he confirmed this, looking at the documents spread across his blotter, and felt, for the first time in his 43 years in banking, a small steady cold thing settle in the very center of his chest. He thought about his daughter. He thought about how she had cried at her grandfather's funeral, about how she had hugged the inheritance papers to her chest in his office afterward and said, with tears still on her face, "Daddy, this means I'll never have to worry, right? Grandpa took care of me." He had told her, "Yes, sweetheart. Grandpa took care of you." He had not added, though he had known it even then, "and if anyone ever tries to take this from you, I will know. I will know immediately. I will know completely. And I will make them wish they had never been born." He had not said it. He had simply held her. And now, 14 months into watching Ansel Voss methodically empty his daughter's inheritance, Theodore Galloway picked up his phone and called Marcus Brennan at the FBI. "Marcus, I need you to put together a federal case. Wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering across state lines. Theodore, how serious is it? Serious enough that I need everything in place before I move. The target has been operating for 14 months. He believes he is being clever. He is not. How much has he taken? $647,000 so far. By my projection, he will reach $800,000 within the next 4 months. He is accelerating. And the bank knows. Every transaction has been flagged. I have personally documented each one. Theodore, who is this man?" There had been a long pause. "He's my son-in-law, Marcus, my daughter's husband. He has been stealing from her for 14 months. Marcus Brennan had been quiet for almost a minute on the other end of the phone. Finally, very quietly, he had said, "Theodore, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Marcus. Just help me make sure he loses everything. Consider it done." Theodore had hung up the phone. He had sat at his desk for another long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the small mirror behind his office door, and quietly straightened his tie. He had not, in the moment he straightened his tie, been thinking about Ansel Voss. He had been thinking about the second discovery he had made 3 weeks earlier, the discovery he had not yet told anyone, not even Marcus, because he was still confirming the details. Theodore had recently learned, a second woman. Not Sydney Carrington. Sydney had been easy. Sydney was the public mistress, the obvious one, the one Ansel had been spending money on for the past 3 years in increasingly public ways. The other woman was older, quieter. She lived in a small apartment in Hartford, Connecticut. She had been receiving wire transfers, $4,000 a month, like clockwork, for 3 years and 7 months, from a holding company connected to Ansel. She had a child. The child was 3.5 years old. The child's birth certificate listed, as the father, one Ansel Voss. Theodore Galloway had photocopies of the birth certificate in his locked drawer. He had not, when he had first discovered this 6 weeks earlier, allowed himself to feel anything about it. He had simply added it to the file. He had been waiting, in the privacy of his office, for the right moment to use it. And the right moment, as it happened, was now 9 days away. His 68th birthday party. At the country club, in front of 230 guests. including his daughter, including his son-in-law, including, though Ansel Voss would not realize this until it was too late, the quiet older woman from Hartford, Connecticut, who Theodore had personally invited and seated at a small corner table on the far side of the dining room. He had not told her, when she had accepted the invitation, exactly what was going to happen at the party. He had simply said, "Asterisk. I think it's time you and my family met each other." Asterisk. She had said yes. She had been waiting, in her own quiet way, for 3.5 years. Sydney Carrington was, by every measure she cared about, winning. She was 32 years old. She was beautiful, striking, in the way real estate agents in the New York exurbs are sometimes striking, with long honey blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and the precise body language of a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning exactly how to lean against a doorframe in a way that men noticed. She had been Ansel Voss's mistress for 3 years. She had been, in her own mind, his future wife for the past 9 months. The beach house had been the proof. Ansel had taken her to see it on a cold afternoon in late October, 2 months before he had purchased it. He had stood with her on the deck overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the wind in her hair, his arm around her waist, and he had said, quietly in her ear, with the precise practiced sincerity of a man who had said similar things to many women in his life, asterisk, "I want this to be ours. I want us to build a life here. I want this to be the place we come home to." Asterisk. She had cried. She had cried real tears. She had believed every single word. What Sydney did not know, what Ansel had been very, very careful to ensure she would never know, was that the beach house was not legally hers. The deed was in Sydney's name, technically, but the underlying ownership was structured through a Delaware LLC that Ansel controlled. If at any point in the future Ansel decided to dissolve the LLC, Sydney would have no legal claim to the property. She did not know this. She did not know, either, that there was another woman. She did not know that the other woman had a 3.5-year-old child. She did not know that the other woman was a quiet 36-year-old physical therapist named Esme Vance, who lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford, and who Ansel had been visiting, by his own carefully maintained schedule, every other Wednesday afternoon for 3 years and 7 months. If Sydney had known any of this, she would not have spent the morning of Theodore Galloway's 68th birthday party getting her hair done. She would not have selected, with such careful attention, the cream-colored Carolina Herrera dress that she had bought specifically for the occasion. She would not have arrived at the country club at 6:15 p.m. on her boyfriend's arm, smiling, radiant, certain that this was the night she would finally be introduced to his family as something more than just a colleague. She would not have, when she walked into the dining room of the Westchester Greenbrook Country Club at 6:22 p.m., smiled politely at a quiet older woman in a soft navy dress who was already seated at a small table on the far side of the room. She would not have wondered, in passing, who the older woman's date was, or why a single woman would be attending such an event alone. She would not have known that the older woman was looking back at her with the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had been waiting, for 3 years and 7 months, to finally see the face of the woman her child's father had been pretending wasn't real. Sydney did not know any of this. She walked into the country club at 6:22 p.m. that evening with the absolute certainty that she was about to become the second Mrs. Voss. She would not, by 8:47 p.m. that same evening, be the second Mrs. Voss. She would not be anything at all. She would be, by 8:47 p.m., standing in the parking lot of the Westchester Greenbrook Country Club in her cream Carolina Herrera dress, watching her boyfriend being escorted to a waiting unmarked vehicle by 2 federal agents, sobbing into her hands, with absolutely no idea how the most beautiful night of her life had become, in the space of 7 minutes, the worst. Theodore Galloway's 68th birthday party began at 6 p.m. at the Westchester Greenbrook Country Club. It was, by every external measure, a perfect evening. 230 guests in black tie. A live string quartet playing softly in the corner. The grand dining room glittering under 3 antique crystal chandeliers. White linen tablecloths. Tall floral centerpieces of cream roses and eucalyptus. The kind of party that wealthy older men quietly throw for themselves once a year because their wives insist. Cordelia Galloway, Theodore's wife of 42 years, had personally overseen every detail. She had not been told what was going to happen at the party. She had been told only one thing, in the kitchen of their home that morning, when Theodore had taken both of her hands in his and looked at her with the calm, steady gaze she had loved for over 4 decades. He had said, Cordelia, tonight something is going to happen at the party. It will be difficult. Cannot tell you what it is yet, but I need you to trust me. And when it happens, I need you to stand up, walk over to Mira, and hold her hand. That is all you need to do. She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, is it about Ansel? He had not answered. He had not needed to. Cordelia Galloway had been a banker's wife for 42 years. She knew the look on her husband's face. She had seen it 3 times in their marriage, and every time it had meant that a man had done something terrible to someone Theodore loved. She had kissed her husband on the cheek. She had said, I will be ready. And she had been ready. She had spent the entire evening, the cocktail hour, the seating of the guests, the salad course, the soup course, sitting beside her daughter Mira at the family table. She had laughed at her son-in-law's jokes. She had smiled at Sidney Carrington when Ansel had introduced her as a real estate colleague I thought would enjoy meeting the family. She had passed Ansel the salt with perfect politeness when he had asked. And she had been waiting. At 8:40 p.m., exactly 7 minutes before the dessert course was meant to be served, Theodore Galloway stood up at the head of the family table. He tapped his crystal water glass softly with his silver dessert spoon. The string quartet stopped playing. 230 conversations died one by one across the dining room. Theodore Galloway looked out over his guests in the soft, warm light of the antique chandeliers. He was wearing a perfectly tailored midnight blue dinner jacket with a white silk pocket square. His silver hair was neatly combed. His face was composed, dignified, almost gentle. He looked, for all the world, like a 68-year-old grandfather about to give a sentimental birthday speech. My friends, he began, thank you for being here this evening. It means more to me than I can say to be surrounded by so many of you on this particular birthday. A small warm wave of polite applause rippled across the dining room. Theodore smiled. He waited for the applause to settle. Before we move to the dessert course, I'd like to make a small announcement. Personal one. Something I've been preparing for some time. He looked down at his wife. Cordelia met his eyes. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply stood up, walked the 3 steps around the family table, and quietly slid into the chair beside her daughter Mira, placing her own small hand on top of Mira's hand. Mira looked at her mother in confusion. Across the table, Ansel Voss raised one eyebrow, smiled faintly, and reached for his wine. Theodore continued. As many of you know, my daughter Mira's grandfather, my own father Augustus Galloway, passed away 7 years ago. He left to my daughter, his only granddaughter, a private inheritance. The exact amount of the inheritance is not relevant to the story I'm about to tell. What is relevant is that the inheritance has been managed, personally, by me, since the day my father died. Every transaction, every account, every single dollar. The dining room was completely silent now. Ansel's hand stopped on his wine glass. He set it down very, very slowly. 14 months ago, Theodore said quietly, I noticed something unusual on my daughter's private wealth account at First Continental Bank. A small, unauthorized transaction. $12,000. Not enough to trigger most alarms. Just enough to test the waters. He paused. It was an interesting transaction, because it had originated from my daughter's account. But it had not been authorized by my daughter. It had been authorized, instead, by my son-in-law. A small, sharp inhale rippled through the dining room. 230 heads, almost in unison, turned to look at Ansel Voss. Ansel did not move. His face had gone, in the space of 3 seconds, the color of fresh paper. For the past 14 months, Theodore continued, his voice perfectly steady, I have been documenting every subsequent transaction. There have been 47 of them. The total amount removed from my daughter's inheritance, as of this evening, is $812,473. Mira's hand, beneath her mother's hand on the table, did not move. Her face, slowly, drained of color. She turned her head very slowly to look at her husband. Ansel was not looking at her. Ansel was looking at the floor. Theodore continued. The funds were moved through 6 layers of laundering, a series of brokerage accounts, 2 offshore shell companies, and finally into a Delaware LLC called Sycamore Crest. Sycamore Crest's sole asset, as of February of this year, is a $1.4 million beach house in East Hampton, New York. The deed is in the name of a 32-year-old real estate agent named Sidney Carrington. Theodore turned his head. He looked directly at Sidney, sitting 2 tables away, in her cream Carolina Herrera dress, who had begun, in the past 40 seconds, to understand exactly what was happening. "Ms. Carrington," Theodore said calmly, "I do not believe we have been formally introduced. My name is Theodore Galloway. I am the father of the woman whose money paid for your house." Sidney made a small sound. It was not quite a word. She did not stand up. She did not move. She simply sat, frozen, with her wine glass halfway to her lips. Theodore turned back to face the room. "My son-in-law has been very thorough in his planning. He has spent a great deal of energy ensuring that his theft would never be discovered. He underestimated, however, one detail. He never bothered to ask, in 12 years of marriage to my daughter, what I do for a living." Theodore paused. He looked, for the first time that evening, directly at Ansel. "I am the regional president of First Continental Bank. I personally oversee every flag transaction on every private wealth account at every branch in the entire northeast region of this country, including Ansel, my daughter's account." Ansel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "For 14 months, I have read every flag transaction. I have documented every one. I have built a federal case in coordination with the FBI's white-collar crime division. There are agents in this dining room right now." 230 heads swiveled. In the back of the room, 3 men in dark suits, who had been seated quietly at a corner table all evening, who had been mistaken by other guests for slightly overdressed business associates, rose to their feet. Ansel began very slowly to stand up. Theodore raised his hand. "Ansel, sit down. I am not finished." Ansel sat down. Theodore took a small breath. "There is one final detail I'd like to share with my family this evening. A detail I have known for 6 weeks. A detail I have not yet told anyone. Not my wife, not my daughter, not the FBI." He looked across the room. He looked at the small corner table on the far side of the dining room, where a quiet 36-year-old woman in a soft navy dress had been sitting alone all evening. "Ms. Vance," Theodore said gently, "would you please stand up?" Esme Vance stood up. She was not beautiful in the way Sidney Carrington was beautiful. She was softer, quieter, the kind of woman who did not turn heads at parties. She had warm brown eyes, dark hair pulled back into a simple low bun, and the calm, dignified posture of a woman who had spent 3.5 years raising a child by herself. Theodore looked at the family table. "Mira, sweetheart, I would like to introduce you to Esme Vance. She lives in Hartford, Connecticut. She is a physical therapist. She has been receiving $4,000 a month for the past 3 years and 7 months from a holding company connected to your husband." Mira's hand, beneath her mother's hand, made the smallest possible movement. "Esme has a son, Mira. He is 3.5 years old. His name is Augustus. He was named, I believe, after your grandfather, though Esme could not possibly have known that, and the choice was, by every account, a strange coincidence of your husband's mind." Theodore paused. "The birth certificate of Esme's son lists, as the father, your husband Ansel." The silence in the dining room was no longer silence. It was something deeper. It was the silence of 230 wealthy people who had just collectively understood that they were watching a man's entire life end in real time at a 68th birthday party. Mira did not cry. She did not speak. She simply turned her head very slowly and looked at her husband. For the first time in 12 years of marriage, Mira Voss looked at her husband the way her father had looked at him 14 months earlier from his 14th floor office. Ansel Voss began, quietly, to weep. Theodore raised his hand toward the 3 federal agents in the back of the room. "Gentlemen, he's yours." Ansel Voss was sentenced 8 months later to 18 years in federal prison. The charges included wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering across state lines, and 2 counts of structuring transactions to evade reporting requirements. His attorney had attempted, briefly, to argue for leniency on the grounds that the funds were taken from a family member rather than a stranger. The federal judge had not been moved. The judge had said, from the bench, that Ansel Voss had committed one of the most calculated and prolonged frauds against a spouse this court has ever seen. The Delaware LLC was dissolved. The Hamptons beach house was seized and sold. The proceeds, every penny of the $1.4 million, were returned to Mira's inheritance account, along with the full $800,000 that had been laundered through it. Sidney Carrington was not charged criminally. She had not, the FBI determined, been aware that the funds in the Delaware LLC had been stolen. She lost the beach house. She lost her boyfriend. She lost, for several months afterward, her ability to walk into rooms in Westchester County without people stopping their conversations to watch her. She moved, eventually, to Phoenix. She did not, for the rest of her life, ever date another investment broker. Esme Vance was not charged with anything. She had been, the FBI determined, an unwitting recipient of the monthly $4,000 wire transfers. She had been told, by Ansel, that the money was an informal child support arrangement and that he had been working through a tax-efficient holding company. She had not questioned it. She had, instead, used the money to raise her son. Mira had quietly arranged, 3 months after the birthday party, through her father, to meet Esme for coffee in a small Hartford cafe. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Mira had cried twice. Esme had cried once. They had not, in the end, become friends. There is no version of that friendship that exists in any world. But they had, by the time they parted, reached a quiet understanding. Mira had set up a small trust fund for Augustus, Esme's son. It was not large by Mira's family standards, only $80,000, but it was enough to ensure that the boy could attend any college he chose, anywhere in the country, without ever once knowing that his biological father had spent his early childhood in federal prison. Esme had thanked Mira through tears. Mira had said very quietly, "He's a child, Esme. He didn't do anything wrong. Augustus deserves better than the man who fathered him." She had meant her husband. She had also meant, in a way she did not say out loud, her own grandfather Augustus, whose name had been used by Ansel in some quiet attempt to claim a legacy that was never his to claim. The trust fund was named, in the official paperwork, the Augustus Galloway Education Foundation. Theodore Galloway had been on the board. Esme cried again when she saw the name. There is one small detail of this story that almost no one knows. The morning after Ansel Voss was arrested at the Westchester Greenbrook Country Club, when Mira had returned, alone, to the house she had shared with her husband for 12 years, she had walked into the entryway, set down her purse and stopped. She had looked at the painting her grandfather had left her, the quiet European harbor, the one Augustus Galloway had told her, when she was 9 years old, was the most beautiful painting in the world. She had stood in front of it for a long time. Then she had taken her phone out of her purse and called her father. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart. The painting. I want to give it back to you. I cannot look at it without thinking about him. About what he tried to do." Theodore had been quiet on the other end of the phone. Then, very gently, he had said, "Sweetheart. I think we should talk. May I come over?" He arrived 45 minutes later. He had stood beside his daughter in the entryway, looking at the painting they had both known for so many years. He had said, "Mira, I want to tell you something I have never told you about this painting." "What?" "Your grandfather did not actually buy this painting in Europe. He bought it from a small gallery in upstate New York in 1962. He paid $800 for it. He told you a more romantic story because he loved you, and because he knew you would love the painting more if it had traveled across an ocean to find you." Mira had laughed. Briefly, the first sound that had come out of her in almost 24 hours that had not been crying. "It's a fake." "No, sweetheart. It's real." The story was just smaller than he made it sound. The painting itself is everything he said it was. He had paused. But I want to tell you something else. 3 weeks before your grandfather died, he and I sat in his living room together for the last time. He told me, quietly in his way, that he was worried about you, that he had liked Ansel when you first brought him home, that he had liked him less the longer he had known him. Mira looked at her father. He told me that day that if anything ever happened to your inheritance, if Ansel ever made a move on the money, he wanted me to do exactly what I did. He told me to wait. He told me to watch. He told me to let the man hang himself. Theodore had paused. His voice had been very quiet. He told me, Mira, that he had named the painting in his will. He had specified that, in the event of any threat to your inheritance, the painting itself should be moved to the bank, held in the vault, until you were safe. The painting, sweetheart. Your grandfather did not lie about buying it in Europe because he was being sentimental. He lied about it because he was hiding what it was actually worth. Theodore looked at the painting. Last year, sweetheart, I had it quietly appraised by Sotheby's. It was authenticated by 3 separate experts. It turned out to be, in fact, a work by an obscure but increasingly collectible 19th-century Dutch master named Jan Hendrik van Grootveld. Your grandfather bought it for $800 in 1962 because the dealer in upstate New York did not know what he had. He paused. At current market values, sweetheart, the painting is worth approximately $14 million. Mira stared at her father. Theodore looked at her. Your grandfather knew, Mira. He knew the entire time. He left you the inheritance, yes, but he also left you the painting. And he told me 3 weeks before he died that if anyone ever tried to take the inheritance from you, the painting would be the thing that ensured you could never, ever be financially destroyed. Mira sat down on the bottom step of the staircase in her entryway. She looked at the painting. She began very quietly to cry, but she was not crying about Ansel. She was crying about her grandfather, Augustus Galloway, who had loved her so completely, for so quietly, for so long, and who had reached forward through 7 years of being dead to make absolutely certain that the husband she had not yet married, when he had quietly arranged this protection, would never be able to take her down. Mira kept the painting. She moved it, eventually, to a new home she bought 2 years later in a small town in the Berkshires. She placed it, exactly as her grandfather had placed it in his own home, in the entryway. She lived alone in that house for the rest of her life. She was, by every measure she came to value, happy. And every morning, when she walked past the painting on her way to the kitchen for her coffee, she would touch the corner of the frame gently with her fingertips, the way she had once, as a 9-year-old girl, touched the corner of the frame in her grandfather's living room, and she would whisper, quietly, to no one in particular, *, "Thank you, Grandpa. Family always knows. *, End.